I guess, Jim, maybe you can make the introductions and we'll get started.
Sure. I'm going to assume you can hear us okay. Is that true, John?
Perfect. Can you see us?
We can't see you, but we believe you're there.
There are thousands of thought leaders here.
Right.
Legions.
And there are millions of us here. I'm Jim Hornthal, and I'm going to take 30 seconds to introduce my friend Steve Blank. That's Steve. Steve is the architect of the Lean Launchpad curriculum, and he's going to talk to you about sort of how he's, what it is, how he's used it, and how it's worked within government capacities, at least in the U.S. And other places. And I'm going to help field some of the questions in Q&A, but I don't want to waste any of your time listening to me ramble on. SteveBlank.com is a great website to learn more about Steve. I'm going to get out of the picture and let Steve take it from here. So thanks, John, for making this possible.
So, John, did you hear any of that?
We heard all of it. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks for
So,
making the time.
So rather than use slides, which I'm afraid something else will break, if you don't mind, I'll just talk for a couple minutes and then take questions. Does that work?
That's fine. Whatever you want.
Great. So we're in a real new age for entrepreneurship. You know, I've been an entrepreneur for, I guess, the first 2 decades of my career, and then has been an educator for almost the last 15. And the world has changed pretty dramatically because we've learned a series of new things we just never knew before. They were out there, but we didn't understand them. Today, we kind of understand that startups, at least here in Silicon Valley, and entrepreneurial education is now based around something called a lean startup. And it might be worth me telling you what that is and how it came about. For most of you, you might remember that what we used to do for startups is make them write business plans. And a business plan is a nice document that describes the problem, the opportunity, the team. It has in the back of it a appendix with an income statement, balance sheet, and forecast with a 5-year forecast. And this used to be the document we not only made entrepreneurs work on, assemble, but we'd actually review it as the premise of financing. And then we would make the entrepreneurs execute to the plan. And in fact, we always in board meetings would refer to how are we doing per plan. And in the past, entrepreneurs would build products by having an idea, going out and getting funding, and then going through alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. And then we'd launch the product, and the biggest problem that entrepreneurs thought they were going to have was where to put the bags of money and whether the building was large enough to hold all the cash. The bad news is it almost never worked like that. That is, after 40 years of doing this in Silicon Valley, we now came to one inescapable conclusion. And that conclusion is no business plan survives first contact with customers. And in fact, executing a plan, in hindsight, is probably the worst thing we can actually ask entrepreneurs to do. This is a big idea. And a lot of things fall out of that. One is the observation that for 40 years, we were assuming that startups were smaller versions of large companies. We now know that's not true. This single big idea, startups are not smaller versions of large companies, makes us think about a lot of things. First is, what large companies do is execute known business models. What's a business model? We'll describe that in a second, but you should think of large companies as focused at their core of execution. They do known things on a repeatable basis. The distinction is that startups, in their first early days, do not execute. Startups surge. Large companies execute. We've spent the last 100 years building tools, processes, methodology, educational curriculum, all around execution. In fact, business schools were designed to generate cadres, masters of business administration who knew how to administer and execute existing corporations. But what we didn't have was any educational curriculum, any process, or even any thinking that said startups are very different in the early stage. And why are they different? You could execute when you have a series of knowns. In a large corporation or an existing company, what do we know? We know who our customers are. We know our competitors. We have an existing sales channel. We know pricing. We know partners. We know resources or activities and things we need to do. And therefore, if we're launching a second or third or adjacent product, we could write a plan, and inside that plan, we could make some assumptions, some forecasts. And they may or may not come true, but at least they're based on a series of knowns. But when we took the exact same document and handed it to a startup, it was the best example of creative writing we could have requested. It was more like a novel rather than any type of document that might generate some facts. So with this observation that startups needed their own tools, we've now invented a series of tools, and the umbrella of these tools is called the Lean Startup. And under the Lean Startup, we suggest that to search, startups need their own tools. And the three I'll talk about for the next 5 or 10 minutes are those three tools. And they are business model design, customer development, and agile engineering. These three components are what differentiate what startups do versus what existing companies do. One of the key ideas is trying to understand what the definition of a startup is in the first place. In fact, I was an entrepreneur for 20 years in 8 companies, and if someone would have asked me, what is a startup, I would have said it was a place that you brought your dog or you got free food. But I never could have given you a concise definition that drove what I did every day. So I'm going to give you Steve's definition of a startup. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. It's this search that requires these new tools. But it's worth parsing the rest of that paragraph. A startup is a temporary organization, means that the goal of a startup is not to become a startup. The goal of a startup is not to be a startup. The goal of a startup is to be a larger company. And in fact, that also means that there is no such thing as a 10-year-old startup. It's really a 2-year-old startup attached to an 8-year-old failure. Designed to search means the startup's activity is not to write code or build hardware or even get orders in its first year. And this actually makes investors very nervous. If it's not doing that, what is it supposed to do? And the answer is it's supposed to search for the entire business model, which includes customers and channel and customer acquisition tactics and product market fit. That is, the job of the entrepreneur is to understand all the components of what it takes to build a large business. And so the tools we use today to do this include something called the business model canvas, which has been popularized by someone named Alexander Osterwalder, who's written a great book called Business Model Generation, which you should all have on your desk at some point. But Osterwalder has taken the word business model and figured out that we can now display all the components necessary to build a company in a single diagram. And Osterwalder's view, which I think is the world's best way to start visually planning for the search, is to draw a business model canvas which has 9 components. What are you building, which is the value proposition? who are you building it for, the customer segments. And by the way, these first two things, what are you building and who are you building it for, they're so important we give them their own special name, product market fit. And then, what's the channel of distribution? How are you going to get, keep, and grow customers? What's the revenue model? Do you have any partners or need any? What resources do you need? What activities do you need to perform to make the company successful? And what are the costs? The job of the entrepreneur for the first months or even years of the startup are to answer these questions. Now, what's really interesting about new ventures is if you have the right founder who's passionate, is they go, oh, Steve, thanks, I can answer these questions. You know, here's our customers, here are the features they want, here whatever. And you go, well, how do you know these? Oh, well, you know, that's what I'm going to go build. And here's the conundrum of a startup, is founders are so passionate, they implicitly believe they understand the customer problem, and therefore all they need to do is build the product and execute. And this is where the lean startup method comes in. We believe that what entrepreneurs really have on day one is nothing more than a series of untested hypotheses. And I use the word hypotheses because when I teach at Stanford, those students pay $50,000 a year, and I like to use big words. But outside of Stanford, the real word for hypotheses is guesses. And so what we really have is in the beginning of a startup is a series of untested guesses about the business. In fact, in reality, on day one, what we just have is a faith-based enterprise. It's a religious activity. There are no facts involved. So what we then do is make our entrepreneurs write down all their hypotheses about each part of the business model, and then use the second part of the lean startup, a formal methodology called customer development, to get outside the building and test each one of those hypotheses. And they do it by using the third part of the lean startup model called agile engineering. Agile engineering says, instead of building the entire product, instead of building every possible feature that the founder thinks that should go in the first release, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to build the product incrementally and iteratively. We're going to build it a step at a time, pausing to get feedback during the customer development process to see if we're on the right path. Now, this method kind of gives us some interesting consequences. These small engineering steps, rather than the finished products, are called minimum viable products, MVPs. And as we're releasing each MVP, we're listening to the customer. And what we might discover is, gee, we have the right features, but we have the wrong customer segments. Or we might have enthusiastic potential customers, but they actually want features 2, 9, and 14. Or we might find that our pricing, they love our product, but our pricing is wrong, or our pricing model isn't incorrect. That is, each part of our business model, we're starting with hypotheses, but we could be wrong. And we now have a language for being wrong. If it's a small change to the business model, price should be $9.99 rather than $6.99, that's called an iteration. But there's a major insight here that says most of the time, we're just going to get parts of our assumptions wrong. We might have the wrong customer segment. We might decide that the customers are in urban areas rather than rural areas. When we figure that out, we call that a pivot. A pivot is defined as a substantive change to one or more of the business model canvas components. Implicitly in this insight about pivots is that startups actually go from failure to failure, learning as they go. That they don't go from the spreadsheet in the back of some hypothetical business plan. And that instead, of firing executives in board meetings when they don't make the plan. What we're actually doing is continually firing the plan. This is a radical rethinking about how to do an early stage venture. For the first time, we're assuming that more than likely our assumptions are incorrect rather than we hired bad people. Now, ultimately, of course, you might hire the wrong people for the job, but it makes the first months or year of a startup into a series of iterations in learning. Now, just to summarize, this might be nice theory. I kicked off this lean startup movement with a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany about a decade ago. I followed it up with a second book called The Startup Owner's Manual last year. But what's more interesting, I think, to perhaps this audience, is we've actually been teaching this in a couple of interesting places. I first put a class together to teach this method with teams of students at Stanford and then Berkeley and now Columbia and Caltech. But 2 years ago, the U.S. government adopted this methodology, which is in a class called the Lean Launchpad. The U.S. government, National Science Foundation, and then our energy agency, ARPA-E, have adopted this method as the way to commercialize science in the United States. We now teach 400 teams a year through the NSF Innovation Corps, which is my adaptation for them of my Stanford class. What's really interesting is we now, after 2 years, have some real data of control and experiment of what happens to teams who go through this process versus teams that take a traditional approach to commercializing their ideas. It turns out at the National Science Foundation, teams that just use the traditional method of I have an idea, I get a grant, I try to commercialize my company, have an 18% success rate, at least to funding. Teams that have gone through this process have a 60% success rate. 18% versus 60%. Interesting set of numbers. So in the last 2 to 3 years, the Lean Startup and the Lean Launchpad class has been adopted widely, and we think it's a fairly radical approach to rethinking entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial education. So with that, I'm happy to take questions and see if we could get a conversation going.
Steve, this is John Kao on this end. Thanks very much for that introductory overview. I guess I'll kick it off with just a few quick questions. One is, you've got 20 countries worth of innovation and entrepreneurship leads here in the room, 14 of which are Latin American countries, 6 of which are some global players that we brought in. What's the international experience been, and what advice would you give to people overseeing entrepreneurship policy, which is rooted in the old model of business plans, financials, and venture capital that looks more like commercial banking? And then as an add-on to that, what's the role of Launchpad Central in creating more of a there for the process?
Well, let me answer the last one first. Is Jim is sitting here, who's the chairman of the Launchpad Central, but one of the core ideas of the Lean Launchpad class is that you want to get out of the building and talk to, at least in the class, over 100 customers, eyeball to eyeball, or video via Skype, or GoToMeeting. And what we want is the instructor to be able to see literally over their shoulder as they've been doing that. And what we were unable to do, other than make them use a blog of WordPress or Tumblr, was to see their progress. And so we invented a piece of software called Launchpad Central that automates the process of gathering customer discovery narratives, updating the business model canvas, and I'll let Jim talk some more about that. And help me understand the short version of your first part of your question.
Well, so we have people here who are in a position to influence the adoption of new approaches to entrepreneurship in their countries. So one is just informational. What's your experience been in the international environment with the lean approach? And then secondly, what advice would you give to someone that is working in a system that's very invested in the old model of business plans and financials and venture capital investment, which looks more like commercial banking because all the ventures has already been de-risked as opposed to being a genuine startup?
Yeah, so let me answer the first part. One of the unintended consequences of teaching the class for the National Science Foundation is in that class, the students happen to be professors. It's a big idea. The students in the National Science Foundation class are professors from universities. And what we didn't expect is they not only learned a ton from the class, but over half of them went back to their own universities and continue to do so and insist that this class be taught in their schools. And in response to that, we actually set up a Launchpad educators course, which we teach every quarter in the U.S. And, people come from all over the world to take the class. So if there are educators who are interested in learning how to teach this, it's offered through a nonprofit called nciia.org. And if you just go to the website, you'll see the class on the first page. The second thing that happened is we kept getting students who weren't quite educators, but who were people wanting to set up incubators and accelerators using this process. And so for the first time this September, we split the class into a special class for those people as well. So if you're interested in using this methodology to do incubators and accelerators, we have a special class for you. The third is in teaching overseas. The country of Colombia has adopted this method. My co-author Bob Dorff teaches there. We've been teaching in Russia. The National University of Singapore, essentially the country of Singapore, has adopted the entire NSF Innovation Core curriculum and is, in fact, I'm going there in September to teach there. And so this has been adopted fairly rapidly and widely. Its adoption by others simply requires one or two things. You either got to believe that this is a much better way to do this, or you don't. And since I'm not selling anything, I tend to leave it to the instructors. The good news is that this is not some incremental version of what people have been teaching before. This is a radical shift. And you either get to see that this produces students and companies that have an incredibly large advantage over those who haven't been through this process, or you don't. And Jim?
Yeah, so I think, let me embellish that answer a little bit. It's not only entrepreneurs having an advantage that adopt this versus those who don't. I think it's governments and countries' innovation policies that adopt this approach and don't. The I-Core program, which Steve architected, which is basically Lean Launchpad at a national level, is where the National Science Foundation is investing significant resources to basically turbocharge the best and the brightest in this country to accelerate the path from innovation to commercialization, and with success, job creation and economic vibrancy. So what we're seeing is pockets of experimentation outside the U.S. borders where other government organizations, entrepreneurs, investors, the whole milieu of entrepreneurial infrastructure support are embracing a way to help startups fail less. And at its best, that's what the Lean approach does. It doesn't guarantee success, but if you fail less, you free up resources, time, energy, and talent to redirect to other more successful or more potentially successful ventures. John, to your question about Launchpad Central, what we've learned is that one of the critical elements at a team level is embracing committed, intelligent domain experts as mentors. And what Launchpad Central does, it allows you to disaggregate the physical geography of bricks and mortars from the ability for mentors to plug into a team. Meaning, I'm running an accelerator this summer at Princeton University, and we have mentors for these 9 teams from all over the world. So they're plugging into the Princeton alumni group the same way any government can plug into their expat community wherever they may live that want to support entrepreneurship back home but can't go back home to meet with the entrepreneurs. So taking advantage of the internet, the way we're talking to you now from Pescadero, California to Santiago-Chile, is a way that teams are dynamically able in real time to not only communicate, but to narrate, annotate, and put out their discovery narratives to be shared by their community, their cohort, their ecosystem of advisors, mentors, teachers. And the last point is that the National Science Foundation, what Steve created, is not only a way of teaching innovation, but with the teaching with teachers, there today are nodes in New York, in California, in Michigan, and in Georgia. Each node of faculty, and the faculty are not architected by career academics as much as entrepreneurs and investors as well. They are taking 4 nodes with multiple cohorts and are taking 300 to 400 teams every year through this process. So it scales nationally, and I think it's safe to say that Steve and I would also believe it scales globally. And so the question, the challenge, the gauntlet that's on the table is who wants to pick this up and bring it to their community, their government, their citizens, as a way of trying to bring greater approaches and more efficient innovation techniques to their economies.
That was incredibly helpful and informative. And, speaking of dissemination to other economies, we have our audience here, so I think I'm going to open it up for all of you. What questions do you have for Steve Blank and also for Jim out in Pescadero, California? And if you could identify yourself by name, just say your name and then ask your question.
Hi, Jim and Steve. I'm Louis Stein, working with John on the conference. We are 7 days away from presenting to the government of Chile a business accelerator that will be the ICT industry business accelerator sponsored by Microsoft Research. So very, very practically, how do we make sure that we use your methodology and dial into this lean Launchpad model?
Oh, it's really hard to hear the question, John. Can you try and repeat it, but also it's hard to hear you. Can you, if you have a microphone, be close to it, because you're very garbled.
So the question is, there's an incubator that's being proposed to the Chilean government in a week, and the entrepreneur in question wants to know how he can wrap Lean Startup and Launchpad Central into the pitch in a week.
Online on my website on steveblank.com, so you should all find the website, steveblank.com, there's a tab on the top called Slides Video. If you click on that tab, you'll get a set of resources for educators and incubators and accelerators, including a link to something called the Educator's Guide, which is 180 pages of the description of the class and description of how Launchpad Central is used. Feel free to borrow any and all of it for text and ideas. It's open source. Feel free to use it.
Right. One of Steve's contributions to this way of thinking is his generosity in open sourcing all of these innovations. I think the ultimate thrill is to watch it work and not necessarily have to feel like you're touching every croissant in the bakery as much as putting a recipe out there that others can take and run with.
The other thing to realize is that the core lectures for the class that are used at Stanford, Berkeley, National Science Foundation are all online and free. And in fact, you could even download the YouTube videos if you want to embed them in your own course. And those are offered at udacity.com, udacity.com. And just look for Steve Blank's class. There's over 125,000 people taking this class worldwide, but they're just the lectures. What the What they really go with is that syllabus and that information you'll see on the slides and video tab on my website.
Right. So, John, if you can explain better, since you're local, the whole phenomenon of a flipped classroom. But what we've been able to do is by having the lectures standardized and available universally, the actual experience at I-Core for the National Science Foundation, at Princeton for eLab, at Stanford and Berkeley, is we can focus on the homework, on what the teams have done week to week, and not on the core curriculum, which is available for free on the internet.
Got it. Okay, other questions?
Hi, I'm Lorraine Harriton. I'm at the U.S. Department of State, and I'm responsible for our entrepreneurship programming. We have a program called the Global Entrepreneurship Program. So I'd like to maybe talk to you about how I can get information out to all our embassies that then they can talk to the different people in the entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world about what you're doing, so that we can, maybe just get it. We work with partners broadly, so we have a sense of distribution channel through our embassies around the world, and we have entrepreneurship contacts around the world. So it's a vehicle that we could maybe get this into the ministries and the entrepreneurial ecosystem around the world. So I'd just like to talk to you about how to package that in a way that might be efficient.
Great. If I understood the question, it was how to get the information to embassies around the world. Is that correct?
Then they would go out to the ministries and to the people in the entrepreneurial ecosystems, like Chile and all around the world. Here we're talking about 20 countries here, but we have about 250 locations around the world. So I just like to take that offline. I sent you an email, Steve, but I probably should send it to Jim.
Send me an email. I'm happy to work with you. My only request is in between then, go take a look at the webpage and go through the slides and video resources, and then let's discuss whether you want to do it in writing or some kind of webcast or something else. So happy to help.
We can talk about, that might be a very good vehicle to webcast or something like that. So, thank you.
All right, so you thought this was about Latin America, but we got a U.S. angle here too. And actually, here's a colleague now from Germany.
Hi, my name is Wolfgang Schuch from Fraunhofer. It strikes me that the model which you've developed is not only applicable to startups, but to any innovation processes which are inside companies who want to develop new products or services also. Have you applied those methods to this particular type of innovation process yet?
John, can you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question is, Lean Startup seems to be applicable to innovation processes more broadly, specifically innovation processes in mature companies. So have you had experience applying Lean to innovation projects, presumably product development activities or, kind of discovery activities within mature
Yes.
organizations?
So the short answer is heck yes. The long answer, it's kind of funny, is when I started thinking about this process a decade ago, is there really wasn't any literature in large corporations that applied to startups. There was literature about innovation in large companies, but none of it was relevant, so I invented my own. The irony is, of course, is now large corporations are looking to startups to figure out how we do it. And just as an aside, this whole Lean Startup process now was on the cover of the May issue of Harvard Business Review, and if you go to my website, you could find a free link to the article on the right. The answer is if the gentleman from Germany is from a large company, you know better than anyone that the last 2 decades have proven that existing corporations doing the same thing they did in the 20th century, not changing a thing, but doing that same things that they did, market share, etc., being number 1 or 2, using those same ideas are going to go out of business. Not because they've gotten dumber, but the world around them has changed. The world around large corporations today is one that has to deal with continuous disruption. And therefore, existing companies now need to worry about, instead of just market share, for example, new market creation. They need to worry about China Inc., globalization, instant information via the internet, consumer taste changing rapidly, barriers of technology innovation just rapidly plummeting, cost of entries for new entrants almost nothing in some domains. And therefore, large corporations need the techniques that startups do. In fact, we could see this because in the last, I'd say 15 years, half of Fortune 100 companies have created a new title called the VP of Innovation. Didn't exist before. So these techniques not only are being looked at, but are being adopted in the large corporations. The one I could talk about, the one that's actually in my book, is the work we did for General Electric to get them into a new business, rather than just building a new factory based on new technology they acquired, which is what the CEO wanted them to do. They, in fact, paused, did an 18-month customer development process, and then built the factory, but this time already having a $500 million backlog before they even started, rather than building a big empty factory. So these techniques have been used in multiple large companies, and I think quite successfully.
Yeah, I think we have examples, John, of global energy companies, pharmaceutical companies trying to stimulate innovation within the organization, applying the exact same technique for customer development, a business model canvas, and a discovery narrative that brings all the participants together in one common theme.
Did that answer the question?
And by the way, the gentleman in question is from Fraunhofer, so he's got a pretty broad view of the German, global corporate ecosystem. So other questions? We don't want to keep you indefinitely, but we've got time for one or two more. And
Yeah, my name is Ignacio Peña, and first of all, I'd like to thank you because what the methodology that you're putting forward is incredibly powerful, and the way that you are distributing it is hugely beneficial to everybody. I'm recommending your methodology to everyone I meet. But I want to ask you a question regarding disruptive business models or disruptive technologies. When I look at John Ford, or when I look at Elon Musk creating SpaceX or creating Tesla Motors, they don't seem to be asking customers what do they want, but rather taking a huge bet in terms of what they think that they need, or what they think that they would like. So how do you make sure that by using your methodologies, entrepreneurs don't end up with incremental innovation rather than disruptive innovation?
So if I understood the question, it kind of boils down to if Henry Ford had asked customers what they wanted, the answer would have been a horse with 6 legs. Is that correct?
right, it's as if to say sometimes entrepreneurs use their gut feel to make big bets where there are no customers to interview, or the methodology doesn't necessarily exactly seem to apply.
Actually, the methodology applies. What really we've lacked is a taxonomy of the fact that the word startup actually talks about 4 different things, and we've confused ourselves for the last 40 years. And let me give you an example. There's a startup entering an existing market. What's an existing market? Well, it's by definition one that has customers, it has competitors, there are products in use, and in fact, the consequence of having an existing market is you could actually get out of the building and ask customers questions about the market. Your first question could be, what's this market called? Then they could actually tell you, oh, it's the smartphone market. And in an existing market, you could ask customers, you know, would you like a higher performance product, and would you pay for it, or what features don't you like? So it turns out there's a class of startups that are entering an existing market. And my definition of when you enter an existing market is you have a higher performance product on an axis that's been defined by the customer. It might be speed, but it might be ease of use, or it might be something else. And so that's one type of startup, and imagining customer discovery out of the building, it's fairly easy. There's a subsegment of an existing market where the incumbent is so dominant that, well, yes, you might have a better product, but attacking them head on, it might be suicidal. So in fact, there are some techniques you could do, which is entering as a niche or entering as a low-cost supplier, meaning figuring out what will people trade off for a lower price. Would they take 80% of the features for 20% of the price? I call this type of startup one that's resegmenting an existing market. Blue ocean strategies fall under the resegmentation as well. In both those cases, existing and resegmentation, you could go out and do customer discovery and things are just fine. But the third case is really kind of interesting. It's a new market. It doesn't exist. It truly is disruptive. You as the founder have a vision that no one else has. By the way, the odds are about 95% of the time, it's not a vision, you're actually hallucinating, but we'll fund you anyway. But to figure out whether it's a vision or hallucination, founders say, well, Steve, there's nothing to do outside the building, so therefore I'll just sit inside and kind of write code or build the products, and then I'll ship it because there's no one to talk to. And that's the mistake. Right there, that's the mistake. Obviously, you can't go outside the building and ask the same questions you could have asked in a existing or resegmented market. But you still need to be getting outside the building, but asking different questions. Your goal in a new market is to try to understand the day in the life of the customer today and envision how the day in the life of the customer will change, assuming they're using your product. What is it that had to happen to make this happen? And by the way, when they do use your product, has it been worth all that effort? And by the way, in a new market, the sales curve looks like this. It's the canonical hockey stick. In an existing market, boy, that sales curve better look like this, taking share from an incumbent. By the way, the fourth type of market is applicable to this audience. Outside the U.S., there's a successful type of startup that clones known successful business models pioneered in other countries. Right now, most of the cloning is going on of taking existing U.S. business models and replicating them in countries where there are language, regulatory, and other barriers for U.S. companies. So 4 types of markets: existing, resegmentation, new, and clone. And the type of activities you do outside the building differs in each. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. So we have time for maybe one more.
Okay, let's take one more.
Anybody else want to crack at this? Going once, going twice? Okay. Hang on.
Okay, Steve, this is Lorraine Harrington again. When I was doing a startup in mid-2000, I was fired because I didn't want to hire a new VP of sales and engineering after we couldn't find the market after a Series B, not only a Series A, a Series B, by the venture capitalists. So I'm wondering whether the venture capitalists are modified their approach much.
So, John, can you repeat the question?
So I think the question was, have venture capitalists evolved to keep pace with lean startup principles, given that Lorraine described a personal experience of inflexibility of venture capitalists. So given that they're part of the ecosystem, where do they sit within the lean ecosystem, if we can use that word?
Yeah. So having lived through this, I have to tell you, it's kind of funny. It used to be that if you walked into a venture capitalist even 3 or 4 years ago and used the word lean or customer development, they'd smack you silly and then have you present your business plan. Nowadays in Silicon Valley, it's almost the inverse. If you're not at least using the buzzwords to a venture capitalist under 40, you kind of feel a little dumb. And Jim, who is a VC, could add some color here. But let me also suggest that even if you are presenting, which is why I remind my students from other countries, even if you are presenting to a traditional venture capitalist, let me show you the difference between what happens with someone who's gone through this process and not. Imagine someone presenting the traditional VC slides as, here's the size of the market, here's the problem, here's the opportunity, here's our great idea, please give me money. Versus, imagine someone coming in who's gone through this process who says, here's what we first thought. Then we got out of the building and spoke to 40 people. Then we realized, boy, that would be a mistake. And so then we changed slightly our customer segment. And so then we got out of the building again. And then those customers were excited, but they suggested that our pricing was too low. So here's what we did. And then after another 35 customers, we got some preliminary purchase orders, and we're here to raise money because we need to execute. Now, none of that requires using the word lean customer development or anything else. But in fact, by just that presentation, you've told investors that you're eliminating as much early stage risk on your nickel than theirs. And Jim?
Yeah, so I think what Steve's speaking to, and I think more and more investors are getting it, is the concept of evidence-based entrepreneurship. And in order to do evidence-based entrepreneurship, you have to apply the scientific method to business. So the scientific method, if you've ever taken a chemistry or biology class, is you have a glass of some fluid. You hypothesize that maybe there's lead in this fluid, and you do qualitative analysis. You determine, yes, there is lead. You do quantitative analysis. It tells you what the concentration of lead is. But if it's not lead, you say, well, maybe it's zinc. Maybe it's some other mineral. And you go through these experiments. Well, historically, we've limited the scientific method to Bunsen burners and beakers and test tubes. What this innovation does is takes the same discipline but applies it to products, markets, and customers. And when you have a conversation with an investor, unless you're truly in the execution phase, we're building version 3.0, we're scaling, we have these distributors, these customers, that's a different conversation. That's, Series B financing. But what the seed and the Series A investors are looking for more and more and more is an evidence-based challenge, and the money you're raising is to run experiments. And they're running experiments in a very lean method, meaning minimum viable product. I think these are my distributors, and I'm keeping my expenses low because I'm not sure this is the product I need to build, and finding ways to rapidly prototype, rapidly test, and staying flexible enough to understand that you're probably wrong, but you want to be right. And Steve's point to fire the hypothesis, not the executive, is a huge idea. And what I'm seeing, and I think I've taught this now 6 times, Steve probably 16 times, is that as the teams understand this, there's a light bulb that goes off. Specifically within the National Science Foundation program, there's 24 teams in a cohort, and they kind of know the scientific method, but they've never really talked to customers. So it's rather quite amusing to watch them do this for the first and second time. It's scary, it's fearful, but then you can see a synapse fire. Oh, I get it. I'm trying to see if this is right. I'm not trying to prosecute its rightness. I'm not trying to beat you over the head with a feature set. But I'm really understanding, is there a valuable product market fit that I can scale? And when that becomes the challenge, a repeatable, scalable business model, that's the business we're in, is to find that, if it exists. The biggest gift we give to teams who, quote unquote, fail in their search for a model is to give them back 2 or 3 years of their life. They conclude that the light at the end of the tunnel is an oncoming train, so they want to get out of that tunnel before they get run over. And to free up that intellectual capacity and that talent to pursue other pursuits that they've determined is the best use of their time is a future dividend, we think, that has untold calculations of productivity and resourcefulness in the future chapters. So I think the headline, John, is evidence-based entrepreneurship is going to be more and more what investors throughout the food chain look for. When you go buy a stock on Wall Street, you're looking at the evidence, the earnings, the competition, the trends, the analyst reports. Those are execution plays. In early stage, whether it's technology or consumer products or other services, it's definitely a discovery risk and a search risk. That's what we're trying to help manage.
So Howard Alper, who runs the Council for Science, Technology, and Innovation of the Government of Canada, wants to insert a final question.
Thanks a lot, and John can relay this if you can't hear me. Translate from Canadian to U.S. English. My own personal experience as a member of the NSF Advisory Committee to the Director was this is the quintessential example of a modern granting agency taking transformative new idea, your ideas, and putting them into practice. The I-Core, the Innovation Core, was an imaginative new approach to a granting agency like NSF. And bravo to you, but also bravo to NSF for being nimble to establish and implement that program. It blew the committee away when it was first presented to it. I just want to relay that.
So that was actually a compliment, not a question. And let me add my compliment and the compliment of our entire group here, because I think people are very engaged with these ideas. I think we've already identified a few next steps. We're going to be in workshops all afternoon to craft the first ever pan-Latin American innovation agenda, but also among the 14 countries represented, I'm sure we've planted some great seeds today. So thank you very much, and I'll see you back home.
Take care, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.